Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second part of the Good Friday timing and the confusion surrounding it. Let's begin the second part with the burial of Jesus, and we will finally see the exact day in which Christ was crucified. Let's go. When Jesus died, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, followers of Jesus, speedily, underline that, speedily placed his body in Joseph's nearby tomb just before sundown. The evidence can be found in John chapter 19, verse number 31 to 33. And let's read. Now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath. Please underline that. Special Sabbath. Because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Verse 38 to 42. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen. This was in accordance with Jewish burial custom. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Please notice verse 42. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. So now we understand that the breaking of legs and the speedily placing of Jesus' body in a nearby tomb is because a Sabbath was beginning at sundown, when work would have to cease. Okay, one may raise an objection that if a Sabbath was beginning at sundown on the crucifixion day, when work would have to cease, and we all know that Sabbath day is Saturday, then obviously Jesus was crucified on a Friday. Where then is the contradiction you are talking about? Now, the contradiction derives from the fact that we have two kinds of Sabbaths. Once again, John chapter 19, verse 31. Therefore, because it was the preparation day that the bodies of those crucified should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, the New King James Version said, for that Sabbath was a high day. Underline that. Then NIV says, and the next day, the day after the crucifixion, was to be a special Sabbath. Now, what is the meaning of the preparation day? In the Jewish culture of that time, the household tasks of cooking and house cleaning were done on the day before a Sabbath to avoid working on God's chosen day of rest. Therefore, the day before the Sabbath was commonly called the preparation day. Clearly, the day on which Christ was crucified and his body placed in the tomb was the day immediately preceding a Sabbath. The question now is, which Sabbath? Now, most people assume John is speaking of the regular weekly Sabbath day observed from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. From John's clear statement here, most people assume Jesus died and was buried on a Friday, hence the Good Friday. Most people have no idea that the Bible talks about two kinds of Sabbath days. The normal weekly Sabbath day that fall on the seventh day of the week, and God's annual Sabbath days listed in Leviticus chapter 23 that could fall in any day of the week. Now, because traditional Christianity long ago abandoned these biblical annual Sabbath days and also as well as the weekly Sabbath, for many centuries people have failed to recognize that what the Gospels plainly tells us about when Jesus Christ was crucified and resurrected, and why Good Friday to Easter Sunday never happened that way. Also, most people fail to note that John clearly tells us that Sabbath beginning at sundown immediately Jesus was interred was one of these annual Sabbath days. John 19:31 emphasized that Sabbath was a high day. What is a high day? A high day is a term used to differentiate the 7 annual Sabbaths from the regular weekly Sabbath days. So what is the high day? What is this high day that immediately followed Jesus Christ's quick burial? The answer can be found in Leviticus chapter 23, verse number 5 to 7, which tells us that on the day after the Passover, a separate festival, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, begins. The first day of this feast is a holy convocation on which no customary work is to be done. So he said the day after the Passover, and we all know that Jesus was crucified on the Passover day. So, okay, what is high Sabbath? A high Sabbath is any of the 7 annual festivals beginning in the spring of the year. They are like Sabbaths, the Passover and the unleavened bread, the Feast of First Fruits, Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles, commanded by God for the Israelites in the Old Testament book of Leviticus. So if a question is asked about the high day that immediately followed Jesus Christ's quick burial, the answer is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is the first of God's annual Sabbath days. It is the high day of which John wrote. Now, several Bible commentaries, encyclopedias, and dictionaries note that John is referring to an annual Sabbath year rather than the normal weekly Sabbath day. Now, on which day was Christ crucified? Jesus Christ was crucified on a Wednesday. Wednesday? Really? Yes. Wednesday. We can prove that from the Gospels. Let's read from Mark chapter 16, verse 1. Now, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices that they may come and anoint him. Now, in that time, if a body of a loved one was placed in a tomb, rather than being buried directly in the ground, friends and family would commonly place aromatic spices in the tomb alongside the body to reduce the smell as the mortar remains decayed. Since Jesus' body was placed in the tomb just before the high day Sabbath began, the women had no time to buy those spices before the Sabbath. Also, they could not have bought them on the Sabbath day as shops were closed. Therefore, Mark says they bought the spices after the Sabbath, when the Sabbath was past. But then, notice another startling, or should I say remarkable, detail in Luke chapter 23, verse 55 and 56. He said, "And the women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed after, and they observed the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and fragrant oils, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment." Hope you have seen the confusion and the contradiction here. The problem here is Mark says that the women bought the spices after the Sabbath, when the Sabbath was past. Then Luke comes in and tell us that the women prepared the spices and the fragrant oils, after which they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. So, they bought the spices after the Sabbath, and then they prepared them before resting on the Sabbath. This is a clear contradiction between these two gospel accounts. Unless, and I repeat, unless two Sabbaths are involved. Indeed, when we understand that two different Sabbaths are mentioned, the problem goes away. Mark tells us that after that high day Sabbath, which began Wednesday evening at sundown and ended Thursday evening at sundown, the women bought the spices to anoint Jesus' body. Luke then tells us that the women prepared the spices, which means the preparation of the spices and the fragrant oil took place on Friday, and they rested on the Sabbath. That is the normal weekly Sabbath day, observed from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset, according to the commandment. Now, by comparing details of both accounts, we can clearly see that two different Sabbaths are mentioned, along with a work day in between. The first Sabbath was a high day, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which fell on a Thursday. The second was a weekly Sabbath day, which is Saturday. Hope it is clear now. Did Jesus rose from the dead? When did that happen? Now we have seen then that Jesus was crucified and entombed on a Wednesday, just before an annual Sabbath began, not weekly Sabbath. So when was he resurrected? Once again, John chapter 20, verse 1. On the first day of the week, that's on Sunday, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Now, the sun had not yet risen. It was still dark when Mary found the tomb empty. Obviously, then Jesus was not resurrected at sunrise on Sunday morning. So when did that take place? The answer is in Matthew chapter 12 verse 40, according to Jesus' own words. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. As we have proven, Jesus was entombed just before sundown on a Wednesday. So let's count forward. 1 day and 1 night bring us to Thursday at sundown. The second day and night bring us to Friday at sundown. The third day and night bring us to Saturday at sundown. According to Jesus Christ's own words, he would have been resurrected 3 days and night after he was buried at around the same time. That is near sunset. Does this fit in with the scriptures? It sure does. It sure does. As we have seen, he was already risen and the tomb empty when Mary went there early in the morning while it was still dark on that Sunday morning. Now, even though there was no one around to witness his resurrection, Jesus Christ's own words and the details recorded in the gospel shows that it had to have happened 3 days and 3 nights after his burial, near sunset, at the end of the weekly Sabbath. Try as you might, it is impossible to fix 3 days and 3 nights between Friday burial and a Sunday morning resurrection. The Good Friday to Easter Sunday tradition simply is not true or biblical. But when we look at all the details recorded in the gospel and compare them with Jesus' own words, we can see the truth and it matches impeccably. I have done a lot of work on this for about 4 years now. I've done a lot of research on the resurrection of Jesus. But this matches impeccably. Jesus rose from the dead. Now, the words of the angel of God at the empty tomb are proven true. Matthew chapter 28 verse 5 and 6 says, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said." So yes, Jesus rose from the dead. Now, in conclusion, I conclude by saying that the only view that fits the biblical account is that Jesus Christ was crucified on Wednesday and buried before 6 p.m. that day. The Jewish day began at 6 p.m., which was the Passover. Therefore, the Passover began on Wednesday after 6 p.m. Also, the women bought the spices on Friday, rested on Saturday, went on Sunday morning and found that the Lord is risen. This is the series of events, and in accordance with Jesus' states of Matthew chapter 12 verse 38 to 40. Jesus was in the grave for 3 full days and 3 full nights. Any other view disrupts the biblical account and the historical facts. Shalom.